The deadline moved, and the moment it moved, Russia stopped acting like an outside observer and started acting like the state trying to write the next chapter. That is where the story begins. Not with the easy media version that Trump delayed again because Trump is inconsistent. Not with the other easy version that Lavrov's phone call was just ordinary diplomacy. Those are surface readings. The real story is that Trump's delay and Russia's intervention are connected expressions of the same deeper mechanism. America cannot cleanly force the next phase on its own timetable, and Russia is moving to make sure that whatever comes after the deadline now passes through Moscow. That is the axis. Everything else runs through it. Look carefully at how Trump handled the deadline. He did not simply extend it. He staged it first. He increased urgency. If no deal is reached, bombs start going off. Then he dissolved urgency. He feels no pressure, no obligation to close a deal in 6 weeks. That is not confusion. It is controlled elasticity, a threat that remains live, a clock that becomes softer, a signal to multiple audiences at once. To Iran, the threat is still real. To the U.S. military, the White House is not yet forcing an all-in deadline. To domestic audiences, Trump still looks strong to everyone watching. The line exists, but the line can move. And that last point matters most, because every time a line moves, the structure around it changes. The source material is direct about why. Since the 28th of February, every Trump deadline in this conflict has been tied to conditions that remained unmet. Every time the line approached, Washington faced the same choice: enforce it and step into a much larger conflict, or quietly redraw it and buy time. And every time the cost of enforcement proved higher than the cost of movement. That is not weakness in the emotional sense. It is system logic. The line moves because crossing it cleanly would require stepping into a full-scale war with a country of nearly 90 million people, mountainous terrain, and decades of preparation for exactly that scenario. That is why the delay matters, not as indecision. As structural admission, the United States still has enormous power, but it cannot simply will the next phase into existence at low cost. And that is exactly the kind of moment an outside power like Russia waits for. Because once America cannot close the question alone, the value of whoever can reshape the question goes up dramatically. That is what Lavrov's move was really about. The call with Araghchi was not routine. The language Moscow published makes that obvious. Russia said it was ready to facilitate agreements acceptable to all sides, especially between Iran and the Gulf Arab states. That is an extraordinarily revealing phrase. Russia is not just offering to help bridge Washington and Tehran. It is positioning itself inside the regional architecture that will define the settlement after the crisis, whether that settlement comes through a deal, an extension, or another round of war that is prepositioning influence. And then Iran answers in the most concrete way possible: uninterrupted passage for Russian vessels and cargo through the Strait of Hormuz. That is not diplomatic filler. That is value. That is reciprocity. Russia offers diplomatic cover and structural facilitation. Iran offers strategic mobility through one of the world's most important choke points. One phone call, one exchange. Two powers locking in a real alignment at the exact moment the American clock is softened. That is why this cannot be read as two separate stories. Trump moves the line. Russia moves into the space created by the movement. That is one mechanism. And once you see it clearly, the next layer becomes impossible to miss. Russia does not need this crisis to end quickly. And in some ways, it benefits from the opposite. The source is explicit about this. The surge in oil prices reshaped the economics of the entire confrontation. Russia, as one of the world's largest energy exporters, does not need to threaten anyone to benefit. It benefits simply by existing inside an environment where uncertainty pushes prices up. The source even points out that the UE, trying to stabilize global supply, loosened pressure on Russian oil flows. So a crisis Washington is trying to manage produces a side effect that benefits Moscow financially. That already matters a great deal. But the uranium question is where Russia's move becomes strategically much larger than a profitable spectator role, because the true center of gravity in these negotiations is not rhetoric. It is control. What happens to Iran's enriched uranium? That is the question that has broken deal after deal. The source lays it out with precision. Iran has roughly 400 kilograms of highly enriched uranium buried underground and enriched to around 60% below weapons grade, but perilously close. America wants it removed from Iranian territory entirely and wants domestic enrichment stopped. Iran has been offering time-limited pauses. Trump then publicly rejects even the 20-year suspension his own negotiators floated, making the American line appear even harder and more maximalist than before. And at that exact moment, Russia makes its move visible, Moscow is ready to take Iran's enriched uranium, reprocess it into civilian fuel, and accept whatever arrangement Iran chooses. That is not a technical footnote. That is the real strategic insertion. Because once Russia publicly offers to become the custodian of Iran's most sensitive material, the room changes. Now, there is a third path, not simple compliance with American control, not total Iranian defiance, a Russian channel that can satisfy the technical need to move uranium while completely transforming who owns the leverage. If the uranium goes to Moscow, then Russia gains something extraordinary. It becomes the long-term custodian of the single most sensitive asset in the entire conflict. It becomes the actor America must deal with whenever it wants reassurance that the material remains secure. It becomes embedded inside Iran's future nuclear architecture, and as the source argues, that gives Russia a bargaining chip that can spill far beyond Iran into wider negotiations over sanctions, NATO, Ukraine, and the broader architecture of East-West tension. That is not mediation. That is strategic custody. And it is why America's silence matters so much. The source does something very smart here. It treats silence itself as a variable and divides it into types, thinking silence, tactical silence, bureaucratic silence, rejecting silence. The key point is not which type of silence Washington is using. The key point is that the silence leaves Russia's proposal alive, public, and structurally relevant. No open rejection, no public embrace, no attempt to force the story back into a purely U.S.-Iran frame. That means the Russian option stays on the table and grows in importance simply by remaining unanswered while the clock keeps moving. That is why the next 48 hours mattered in your source. And it is why the structure matters more than the headline. People keep asking, will there be a deal? That is no longer the sharpest question. The sharper question is, if there is a deal, whose framework will it belong to? Will it be an American deal that removes uranium under American-defined oversight and strategic terms? Will it be an Iranian delay dressed up as compromise? Or will it become a Russian-framed settlement in which the technical outcome serves a much larger Moscow strategy? That is the battle. Now, not just deal versus no deal, framework versus framework. And once you see that, the deadline shift makes complete sense. Trump did not move the deadline because nothing was happening. He moved it because too much was happening. The war risk remained too expensive to force on schedule. The uranium question remained unresolved. The Gulf states needed reassurance. The mediators were active. And Russia had stepped far enough forward that the endgame was no longer a clean bilateral contest. That is not hesitation. That is a system becoming multipolar under pressure. That is why the source keeps insisting these are not two separate stories, because they are not. The move deadline and the Lavrov call are the same event viewed from different angles. One shows America admitting the next phase cannot be forced cheaply. The other shows Russia stepping in to shape the terms of that next phase before it formally begins. And that is the real strategic shift. This is no longer just about whether Iran folds or whether Trump bombs. It is now about who defines the architecture of resolution if the crisis moves from raw confrontation into managed settlement. That is where Russia wants to win, not by firing, not by escalating directly, by becoming impossible to remove from the table. That is the absent profiteer at its most dangerous. It profits from oil, it profits from relevance, it profits from delay, and then if the opening appears, it profits from becoming the custodian of the very asset that has kept the whole conflict locked for years. That is why this moment matters so much. The deadline moved, yes, but the larger truth is more important than the movement itself. The movement created a gap, and Russia did not waste a second moving into it. That is the story, not delay as confusion. Delay as structural opportunity, not diplomacy as peace. Diplomacy as competition over who gets to design the shape of the next order.